Welcome everyone to the virtual session from WISCA America on the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, Opportunity or Threat. We all have managed to pull this together under very difficult times, and I'd like to start off by introducing our panelists today. We've got a great set of panelists. Jonathan McCormick serves as the Deputy Director of the Rural Broadband Auctions Task Force at the FCC. Prior to that, he served as an attorney advisor in the Office of Economics and Analytics, the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, and with the Incentive Auction Task Force. In 2019, he received the FCC's Employee of the Year Award for his contributions in designing, overseeing, and launching facets of the Mobility Fund Phase 2 Challenge process. Jonathan will be starting off with an overview of the RDOF auction. Our other two panelists, we have Steve Coran, who is a member of Lerner Center, a Washington, D.C. communications law firm, and chairs its broadband practice group. He has served as outside counsel to WISPA since 2007 and also represents a number of WISPs with respect to spectrum acquisition, spectrum and subsidy auctions, compliance, transactions, and licensing. Finally, Ted Osborne leads NextLink Internet's strategy and corporate development activities as the company rapidly advances its CAF Phase 2 funded broadband and voice capabilities across our agricultural heartland. Ted started a Colorado-based WISP in 2003 and has since been active in the industry as an owner, operator, investor, and consultant before joining NextLink last year. And finally, myself, I'm the moderator, Carol Maddie. I currently am doing consulting for a variety of entities that are interested in the upcoming Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, and formerly I was at the FCC as Deputy Wireline Bureau Chief, creating and implementing the Connect America Fund. With that, I'm now going to turn it over to John.
Thanks, Carol. So as the next step in the FCC's efforts to close the digital divide, the Commission has established the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, which will provide up to $20.4 billion to connect millions of rural homes and small businesses to high-speed broadband networks. The Rural Digital Opportunities Fund framework builds upon the success of the 2018 Connect America Fund Phase 2 auction. RDOF would award support through multi-round descending clock auction in two phases. Phase 1, which we'll be talking about here today, is also known as Auction 904, will target those areas that are wholly unserved by voice and fixed broadband networks with minimum speeds of 25 megabits per second download and 3 megabits per second upload. Phase 2, which will happen at a later date, will target unserved locations identified through the Commission's new Digital Opportunity Data Collection, as well as any areas that are not won in Phase 1. So for an overview of the rural auctions that we've got going on, over the last couple of years, the Commission has taken a number of steps to close the digital divide by awarding support via auction, including the Connect America Fund Phase 2 auction, completed in 2018, that awarded over almost $1.5 billion over 10 years in Auction 903. The Rural Digital Opportunity Fund adopted recently, which would award up to $20.4 billion over 10 years in two phases. Phase 1, which would award up to $16 billion, is Auction 904, and then Phase 2, which has the remainder of the budget at a later date. The Phase 1 auction is expected to commence bidding in October of this year. And finally, the 5G fund, which is announced by the chairman in December, would award up to $9 million to support deployment of 5G service to rural America. In 2011, the Commission adopted the USF ICC Transformation Order, which introduced the use of a cost model to identify high-cost areas and competitive bidding, or auctions, to award support. The Connect America model was developed in 2014, and the model estimates costs of providing service and the number of locations in census blocks nationwide. High-cost blocks were identified as those above a certain cost threshold. The Commission offered model-based support to price cap carriers in 2015 to deploy service to high-cost locations in their study areas by 2020. The Rural Digital Opportunity Fund is largely built upon the framework of the successful CAF Phase 2 auction. That had an auction of high-cost support to census blocks where carriers declined offers of model-based support. excluding areas where carriers reported voice and over 10.1 broadband service. Bidders bid for support to serve eligible locations in high-cost census blocks, aggregated into census block groups for bidding. The auction had over 30,000 census block groups containing 210,000 blocks and 975,000 locations, with a budget of $2.15 billion. Connect America Fund Phase 2 closed in August of 2018 with approximately $1.5 billion in support awarded to provide service to more than 700,000 locations across 45 states. As of this month, $1.43 billion of that support has been authorized. The Rural Digital Opportunity Fund framework will provide up to $20.4 billion in support over 10 years to serve locations that lack voice and greater than 25.3 broadband service. We'd use a two-phase approach, with phase 1 including blocks that entirely lack 25.3, that would receive $16 billion, and phase 2 including partially served blocks and blocks unsold in phase 1 for the remainder of the budget. Again, it will use a multi-round reverse clock auction similar to CAF phase 2. Generally speaking, all census blocks that lack voice and 25.3 megabits per second broadband service will be eligible for support, except for non-high cost blocks, those that have a lower threshold, would not be included, as well as tribal areas and blocks lacking even 10.1 would have an even lower threshold from that. Certain blocks that are awarded funding in CAF Phase 2, blocks that are awarded funding through federal and state broadband programs, as well as census blocks in certain rate of return service areas. Last week, the Commission released a public notice announcing the preliminarily eligible areas and establishing a limited challenge process to correct for those. This challenge process provides an opportunity to challenge the list of preliminary eligible areas, for example, to identify census blocks that have become served by voice and 25.3 megabits per second broadband service since the most recent Form 477 data was filed, blocks that have been awarded funding by a federal or state broadband subsidy program to ensure service of greater than 25.3. Well, this ensures that limited funds are not used to overbuild areas that already have service, but the intent is to exclude areas where 25.3 service has or will be deployed, not to prevent bidders from accessing other funding sources, including from states. Note that this is a voluntary filing. Additionally, within rate of return service areas where the carrier does not expect to extend broadband as part of its USF obligations. These eligible areas can be downloaded or viewed on a map on the Commission's website at the address on this slide below. The current timeline for Auction 904, after having adopted an R&O in late January and a public notice seeking comment on the procedures for Auction 904 in February, would have the Commission adopt the 904 procedures this summer, followed by release of the eligible areas after the challenge process concludes, and then finally a window to file short-form applications to participate. Bidding in Auction 904 would then commence in late October of 2020. After the auction concludes, we would then announce the close of the auction, followed by the window to file long-form applications for winning bidders, and then funding would finally be authorized. Similar to CAF 2, we will use a single nationwide multi-round reverse clock auction with competition within and across geographic areas to identify those areas to receive money and determine the support amounts. Bidders will bid by committing to provide broadband service that meets or exceeds a particular performance level, that is speed, data allowance, and latency, at a specified percentage of an area's reserve price. Clock prices start out higher than the budget and decrease in each round until the auction clears, that is, the implied support being requested is less than or equal to the budget. Different performance levels have different tier and latency weights that reduce the percentages of the reserve price a bidder can receive, and these weights reflect a preference for higher speeds and lower latency. One change from CAF 2, at the clearing round, support will be awarded to the bidder with the lowest weight. If there's more than one bidder that has that lowest weight, then bidding would continue similar to how CAF 2 proceeded. These service tiers represent the different performance and latency requirements for bidding in the auction, including a minimum speed of 25.3 all the way up to gigabit tier of greater than or equal to 1 gigabit per second download and 500 megabits per second upload. Similarly, there's a latency tier for higher and low latency services as well. Bidders that win support must deploy and offer service meeting the performance levels for which they bid. The auction will close once the aggregate bids for support decrease to $16 million when the auction will clear and there are no more competing bids. Both of those conditions have to be met. Winning bidders must deploy service and meet certain service milestones, including offering voice and broadband service to up to 40% of their locations by year 3, increasing by 20% each year until they have to hit 100% of the model locations by year 6, and then increasing to 100% of actual locations, not the model-based locations, by year 8 after we've collected new data about the service areas and the serviceable locations in the census block through the new digital opportunity data collection. Rates must also be comparable to similar services in urban areas, and there's mandatory reporting on the progress as you build out. So as a comparison between CAF Phase 2, in case you are familiar with that auction, generally the auction application process is the same. There's a 2-step short form and long form application. The per location funding threshold for identifying high cost blocks, however, is quite a bit lower in the Rural Digital Opportunities Fund versus CAF Phase 2, including an even lower threshold for tribal areas and areas lacking even 10.1 megabits per second service. There's also a per location support cap that is higher. Again, tribal areas and areas lacking in 10.1 are subject to an even higher support cap than that. And as mentioned previously, at the clearing round, support will be awarded to the bidder with the lowest T+L weight. However, bidding will continue, like in CAF Phase 2, if more than one bidder has that same lowest weight.
Thank you very much, John. Anything else, or ready to turn it over to our other 2 panelists?
Ready for the other panelists.
Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to our outside expert. So take it away.
So thanks, Carol. This is Steve Karan, and again, thanks for joining us for Virtual WISP America. Let me talk a little bit about the eligibility rules, and this is what you need to note in order to participate in the RDOF auction. So please advance. There we go. So one way you can participate is by certifying that you have provided voice, broadband, or electric transmission or distribution service for at least 2 years. And if you qualify under that criterion, then you could submit audited financial statements from the prior fiscal year if those are available. And if you do not have audited financial statements, then you can submit unaudited financial statements along with a certification that you're going to submit audited financial statements after the auction on a deadline that the FCC will set. And the reason for this is that the FCC rightfully decided before the CAF auction that audited financial statements should not be table stakes just to gain entry into the auction itself, but if you were successful, then it would be worth the time and the effort and the money to have audited financial statements created. You also need to certify that you have filed Form 477 for the 2-year time period covered by those financial statements. The second way that you can qualify for the auction is to submit audited financial statements for 3 prior fiscal years and a letter of interest from an eligible bank that will provide the letter of credit. And this would be an option for those that can't demonstrate that they've provided broadband, voice, or electric transmission or distribution service for the last 2 years. Any recipient of RDOF support is going to need to go through generally a state and in some instances an FCC process to become an eligible telecommunications carrier for the funded areas. And that process is usually done by a petition to the state Public Service Commission there are certain state requirements that need to be satisfied or demonstrated. Then the state will issue an order. The FCC requires that order to be uploaded into the long form along with a statement that the ETC designation covers all of the census blocks where you're the auction winner. Again, back in a few years ago, the FCC decided rightfully that you didn't need to be an ETC as stable takes to participate, but if you were successful, you would have 6 months to comply with the ETC certification process. So good news there. There's also, and we'll talk about this more as Ted and I get into some of the details here, a due diligence certification. Basically, the FCC says, if you end up with something and you didn't do your due diligence, don't blame us, which means that you really need to go through a very extensive process if you want to do this right to figure out how much you want to, where you want to bid, how little you want to bid, and understand what the post-auction commitments are in terms of letters of credit and reporting and build out. So very important that in order to make that certification that you've done your homework. Next, please. One final thing, if you are a total defaulter under CAF, you are not permitted to participate, but if you are a partial defaulter, then the FCC has said it's okay for you to participate in RDOF. Ted, I think you've got this one.
Thank you, Steve. Glad to be with you all. I think as a segment on eligibility rules relative to preparation that you might take in going forward, want to point out something that's that everyone should understand, that the need to be an eligible telecommunication carrier is a statute, as the funding on universal service is provided through the USF fee that people pay for their voice service. So that's the source of the capital, and it's because it's managed from a regulatory perspective at the state level. That helps drive what is important in terms of preparing for the auction. Let's say, for example, that you have a network and it crosses, say, 2 states, and that network is has RDOF money available that is appealing to you. What you will do is file one application to be eligible to bid in the RDOF, and when you win, you will win, if you do, a certain amount of the proceeds that is for each state, not combined, but you have to think of each state now as a business model. It is the state level that you'll have the letter of credit, and it's the state level that you will report any location discrepancies where the number of intended households to serve turns out by your inspection to be something different, and to qualify under the regulatory regime of each state PUC. So I want to just point that out just to help you understand the dynamic at the state level in preparing for a federal auction opportunity in RDOF. I think the first thing that I would advise you to do is to read the rules and ask an expert. The FCC does a fabulous job of providing a considerable amount of training information that will help guide you in thinking through the auction, how the auction works, how to prepare your application, things to look out for, and it's a together, it's a rather complex dynamic to understand. So reading the RDOF rules, speaking with experts, legal experts, financial experts, and accounting experts about how this will impact your business, and to ask, even the fundamental question, am I looking at RDOF as an opportunity, or is it something that really is a threat to me? So the best way to make that determination is to understand your market. Maybe it is your current footprint where you have service gaps that you want to fill in, or it may be adjacent marketplace to your existing infrastructure. So the best way to do that is to go to the auction website, pull down the data, map these data for the census block group that the funding will be, assuming that that's the final decision that we're going to be funding census block groups instead of census tracts, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. And look at the density of that market and begin to develop a business plan. Before you're going to develop the business plan and finalize it, you'll have to come up with a network design to achieve the serviceability rules that you're making a commitment for. Keep in mind that the 4 tiers that John spoke of are available to you to mix and match. So in one part of a state, you may decide that that market is something that you can compete in at a service tier, let's say, of 25 down, 3 megabit uplink. In another part of that state, you believe that you can serve something different, gigabit, just for example purposes. And you're able to bid in these distinct bidding units, one service plan versus another. So you'll have to determine what the network has to look like and what the components are and the cost of those components and the capital to put boots on the ground to develop this network within the time frame that you're afforded per the rules. And then I think we look at the business model. In that case, I recommend that you develop a 10-year model because you're going to be paid for a 10-year period of time. You only have 6 years to build it out in full. And you have milestones to meet, as John talked about, where you have to be at a certain level each year following year 3 or at the end of year 3. And that's 40% of the network build out and 20% per year following until you get to year 6 and you're at 100%. So to identify you need to identify and resolve the gaps. What I mean by that is that this may be an activity that is a little different in how you've managed your network in the past. So you need to understand if you have gaps in the talent pool that you have to depend on, or in rights of way access that you didn't have before, and other tests that you might want to do to determine at scale what one type of a network versus another needs to look like relative to all those components. All of that will go into this 10-year set of projections that I briefly mentioned. And when you put those costs in, remember that a small mistake on the assumption of, say, 1,000 units, maybe it's a radio, a backhaul. One small mistake may, at the end of the day, be a pretty significant number that you don't want to fail and have specific budget for. And you're going to be limited to the amount that you win. And you may have to come forward with some additional capital to invest in the USF funding activity. So you have to be brutally honest in that model. Don't take wild guesses and assumptions to try to make this determination. Err on with caution every opportunity you get in that model. And then I think it's very important to ask yourself, do you have the capacity to build, and do you have the desire to manage an advanced network where you are making a commitment not just to the FCC but to state authorities on the ETC status? So you have to be able to stay in the game and make sure that the promises you make up front are promises kept. Else you're subject to the draw of the letter of credit, which protects the public interest that you will build that network to the specifications and in the time frame. And then ongoing regulatory requirements is something that I think you should get legal expertise to help you. I will tell you that I personally have been through this twice, once through the rural broadband experiment, and again, NextLink being a winner in the CAF competition in 6 states. And I found that each state can be a little different in terms of getting the authorizations. The model's different. What you have to do to prepare and provide to the state is different. And there's opportunities for people, say, an adjacent network, to look at what you've won and say, well, I want to contest there being an eligible telecommunications carrier in a state. And that can be a long, drawn out legal process. And I know of a number of CAF winners that are WISPs that had to endure that and stay the course, because there's no turning back. You have to be able to meet the ETC requirement. So if you're able to meet the 10-year commitment and it's something you believe fits your organization, then this is a wonderful opportunity to do so. When you stop and think about where we are at this moment in time, it has been in development now for probably 9 years. And Kira was a part of being an architect of this program, where fundamentally they wanted to take a funding mechanism that was going to the incumbent carriers that competed against you. And they did that year after year after year. And we weren't getting the innovation from voice services into broadband. And the FCC determined in 2014 that it would establish a set of rules that would allow any organization that is eligible to participate, take place, and become an incumbent in an area as the service provider of last resort, meaning voice and broadband. So it truly is a dynamic opportunity. There's ways to win, whether you participate or whether you just inform yourself. And we'll talk more about that in a moment.
Oops. Sorry about that.
Well, thank you.
Moving on. Sorry.
Well, Steve, let's you and I share in this one. In terms of the opportunity.
Sure. Why don't you, yep, go ahead.
Yeah, so we're going to have a conversation with you about the opportunity and the threat. And just to kick it off, and we'll make this interactive, Stephen, RDOF subsidy is a great way to secure capital. The challenge that our industry has had over the years has been a lack of access to spectrum, a lack of access to capital. And the lack of access to spectrum has caused a lack of access to capital. But now we know that it is a mission critical activity, an essential service that we need to bridge this digital divide. And when public money comes to the table, I will tell you with personal experience, private capital follows suit. And they're now not looking skeptically at the opportunity to invest, but rather, they're leaning forward and their elbows are on the desk. So when you have public capital, you will have an opportunity to aid that with private capital if that is your desire.
And we're starting to see some of that for some of the CAF winners, and I'm really happy that the outside community, strategic investors, have realized that by leveraging the RDOF money or the CAF money, that it makes balance sheets look better and the opportunity look better, and help some of these companies scale up more quickly, and with the capital and with some of the resources they can bring. Let me take the second one here, and I think it's also important here, is that it provides you an incumbent position in your market. You may not be the only one in the market, but you will have build-out commitments that will incent you to build out. You will be offering, in many cases, a higher quality of service. And you may be better positioned to provide competition to other platforms that may come down the road, such as low Earth orbit satellites. Future-proofing your network. In RDOF, there is a strong premium both from the weighting tiers that the FCC has proposed, as well as the clearing round bid processing, to propose as fast a speed, and gigabit tier is preferred in a way that it wasn't in the CAF program. And it's real important to understand that going in, because it will affect your network deployment architecture. It will affect your bidding strategy as well.
And I'll speak to that
Yep.
as well if I can, Steve, that, let's compare the CAF to the RDOF. In CAF, the lowest minimum speed that was available to bid was 10 megabit over 1. In RDOF, that service plan does not exist. Now the minimum is 25 over 3. Now, why is that? The fundamental statute of universal service is that people in rural America should have the same level of communication capabilities as that is enjoyed in urban markets. So as urban markets begin to move toward 100 megabit and gigabit service and beyond, there will be a requirement for the USF to focus on future-proofing the network that's being invested in today. So that is to say that if 25.3 is the minimum tier today, given the demand of users oftentimes being at 50 megabit, the bidding a 50 megabit service plan, if you can design a network to do that, it would be a future-proof opportunity for you. And there's a benefit in terms of the amount of award that you would be provided to build a faster network, which is a lower tier.
I was talking a couple of days ago with someone at the FCC, and he was talking about, the new program that's going to come around in 2029. We all may not be around for that, but the drove home for me that RDOF is another step in the process. And as consumers demand more and more bandwidth, we're going to be seeing these programs continue. So, Ted, why don't you take these last ones
Sure.
here, because these are your bullet points.
Yeah, happy to do it. So what's the point of giving you a platform of gives you greater accomplishment? What we're trying to say here is that as you become, future-proof your network and become the incumbent within your market, it's going to grow your business. You're going to have greater accomplishment for your business and in your communities that you serve. And serving your community is something that CAF winners have found to be an important consideration and why they pursued this and won and what they're enjoying now. The subsidy can help leverage a strategic investment. So it may be that you have an interest, for example, in the PAL auctions and the CBRS auction 105. So having an anticipation for winning subsidy and bringing in a strategic investor that will allow you to compete for CBRS spectrum may be something that works for you. And I think the next item.
Yep. Now we're talking about threats.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. So let me kind of take the first couple of these because I'm the lawyer here, and it's important for me to kind of be the one who sounds the alarm. And that is that you really need to be able to scale and add expertise. And I think we touched on this before on an earlier slide, but super important that you don't bite off more than you can chew. It's going to be a very, very ugly situation if you commit to doing something and then for one reason or another can't meet the obligations. That means you're going to need to add expertise. You're going to need to, dare I say, add lawyers, add accountants. You're going to need to do some mapping up front for sure. You're going to need, as Ted said, to put a 10-year budget together. You're going to need to have network people. You're going to need to have HR expertise to hire and manage the extra layers of personnel that you're going to have to implement and deploy. So it's not for the faint of heart. This system is not designed for every WISP, for every provider, for every satellite company, or for every telco. You really need to, and I go back to the due diligence certification, go in with this eyes wide open, and if you decide to walk away, that may be the best decision that you've ever made. Ted, I think you've got experience with that second bullet, so maybe you can talk about what you need to do just to sort of position yourself to get ready to receive the money.
Sure. Well, there's a lot of work that has to take place before you receive your first check. And that certainly includes audited financials It includes getting an opinion letter from a bankruptcy attorney that the proceeds would not be tied up in a bankruptcy if that were the something that your business has to do. But the biggest one, and the one that's hardest to understand, is the capital outlay for legal support to get the ETC status from these states. I will tell you that NextLink invested more than $500,000 getting ETC status in 6 states. And again, they were all very somewhat different. So that money had to be spent before we got our first check. And the time that we won, which was July of 2018, to the time we got our first check, which was July of 2019, seemed like a long period of time, to wait to get started, because we were very anxious to do.
Let me throw one other thing in there, which is taken on recent importance and is something that I've been spending a lot of time on, and that is locations. So the FCC has provided guidance on what constitutes a location, and it's an easy word to kind of gloss over. But when you get right down to it, there are some, I don't want to call them deficiencies, but lack of completeness in the FCC's estimate of the number of locations, which was an estimate that was done 5 or 6 years ago when we didn't have a lot of the mapping software and processes we have. And second of all, really important is that effort did not attempt to determine where in the census blocks each location was. We've come a long way on the mapping, and there are new software and data sets out there. And I guess the point here is the FCC is estimating what the number of locations is. In a lot of cases, when you go out and actually map locations, you'll find out that it's going to be less than that. So that raises some questions about how to bid, where you should be bidding, and doing a lot of network planning around those locations before you get into the auction, because it can be a real time problem. Here, at least, the FCC has made the very good step of saying, we'll take care of the mapping over 6 years and tell us what we find, but that's not going to help you on the front end. So really important to get a real good sense of what the landscape is in terms of the number of locations and where those locations are in each of the census blocks that you may be bidding in, because you may find they're different from what the FCC's estimate are in a way that's material. Another thing is think about 10 years of extensive reporting and compliance obligations, not just reporting every single location that you can offer service to by latitude and longitude in the FCC's portal, but there's extensive speed and latency testing. And I can tell you, having lived through the FCC's process to get that in a place where it is now, it's very extensive. There are consequences associated if you do not hit your speed tier and your latency tier 90% of the time 80% of the time, 80% of the uploads and downloads, 80% of the time for speed, and 95% of the latency mark, which is 100 milliseconds or less. Understand where you're testing to and from, understand what the consequences are, understand that you could be losing funding for missing a speed and latency benchmark even before you lose funding for not hitting one of your construction milestones. And lastly, there's state and federal reporting that is on an annual basis. It's not trivial. It's not over the top either, but and each state is a little bit different. So understanding what that is before you get into the process will help you. Next. Finally, the last one on there was skeptics will be watching closely. There are folks who are not real fond of seeing WISP be successful. There are people there that really don't like these programs. Congress is going to be watching to determine to look at the success of the program. There are a lot of people who want to succeed, and that's most of the people. There are a few who are going to be watching this closely for other reasons. And Ted, why don't we jump back up to the prior bullet and talk about the potential for new competition?
Sure. We do have a note here about LEOs, low or Earth orbiting satellites. With the development of 3 satellite companies, I think one is about to file bankruptcy, but the remaining 2 are putting birds in the sky at low orbiting um, distances, which can overcome the 100 millisecond latency obligation and provide faster service than what the satellite providers were out there bidding before, which was 10.1 and 25.3 megabit tiers at high latency. So these other low orbiting Earth satellites are able to bid the lower tier of latency, and they're talking about being able to offer 100 megabit service or even maybe gigabit service. None of that is proven yet. They are just initiating those launches in the sky, and you can expect that they will, in some manner, compete in the RDOF.
And even if they don't compete in the RDOF, they could be a significant competitive threat to your business down the road, given that, send you an antenna in the mail and drop it on your roof and somehow connect it to a router, and you could be in business. And I think that's the model that they want to have, is basically ship and you install. So something to think about, and I think it's at this point rather unquantifiable.
Agreed.
Okay, now we can move on.
Yeah, so what about the idea of winning in RDOF through alliances? What we mean by that is, when you take a look at this program, and I encourage every WISP to know the rules, know what impact it might have in their market, how much money is available and where, and how many locations will be served as a result of that activity. And it may be, after you do your analysis, that you determine that, hey, you're going for it. You're going to be, you're going to seek to be an eligible bidder, and you ultimately win. In the case of CAF, there were 15 WISPs that won more than half of the subsidy and took responsibility for 307,000 locations in 25 states. That is not an insignificant change in the marketplace. And I think that I can report that these CAF recipients, the WISPs, are well off to a great start in getting their networks designed and built. So really happy to see that. It may be that you decide that the size of your business doesn't make it. It's hard to cover the additional legal expense over a smaller business, and so it just doesn't make economic sense. Or you don't believe that as an owner you feel like you can step up to a 10-year commitment. So I would ask you to think about RDOF not as a serial on-off play, whether it's something that you want to do or not do, but rather something that exists. The money will go to somebody. It may be the incumbent carriers that didn't show up in the CAF auction to any real extent. It may be other WISPs that you already know. And I would encourage you to think about, what are your personal goals? What are the goals of your business? What are you really trying to accomplish? And while it could be a threat to your existing base, it could also be an opportunity if you can offer something to the other party. Let's say a winner of RDOF proceeds can say, look, I love your business. You're in the market that I now am obligated to serve. I'm just like you, a kindred spirit. I don't want to overbuild you. I'd rather work with you if you want to help bring capacity to what I'm building here. Let's get together. And there may be real opportunities. I will tell you, NextLink has only made one announcement so far. There will be a few others to come shortly, where we decided that in a market we really loved a group of operators, and we loved their vertical assets and what they brought to the table in terms of us accelerating our performance and fulfilling our CAF obligation. So it could be very exciting. Think about, if you do want to partner with a winner of these proceeds, what it is you have to offer, and negotiate something that is mutually beneficial. It's also in the interest of, it's the public interest of dividing accomplishing the services for rural America that we all seek to do. And if you can structure a deal that gives another operator the promise for acceleration in the market, so that they can participate, in the next round of funding, whether it's federal or state, then that could very much be a win-win at a time that M&A activity in our industry has been, frankly, de minimis over the last 5 or 6 years, with the primary consolidator that simply stopped consolidating businesses and giving people an exit opportunity. So RDOF will represent a significant activity in the world of mergers and acquisitions. And so think about how you can play with that.
Well, I think you all have shared a wealth of knowledge. Thank you so much. I'd like to follow up with some questions. This has really been a very informative discussion. I moderated a similar panel at WISPalooza back in Las Vegas in October, and I asked both Ted and Steve what was the dark horse issue that they thought would emerge in the RDOF that was not necessarily obvious. I don't remember exactly what you said. I think we talked a bit about the election and the possibility of a recession, but I'm utterly sure that neither of you warned of a global pandemic. So my question for Ted and Steve is, do you think the FCC should slow down the timing of the RDOF auction in light of the current situation, the healthcare crisis? And why or why not?
I'll take the first stab at that. Carol, thank you for the question. We have already seen a delay in the CBRS auction. It's difficult for me sitting in my home office in Colorado these days without the ability to travel to DC, what the FCC has to contend with in trying to keep everything moving along at a very rapid pace. Perhaps, I think, maybe more auctions in the 2020 period than any other time in the FCC's history. But there are many lessons of this COVID-19. For one, it tells us that our work across rural America is essential. I recommend that we build fast and furious to get fixed wireless or gigabit services from wireline facilities at these households as fast as possible. It's needed increasingly for in-home learning to prepare our young people for their role in America's future. And the caveat implied here is that we have to keep in mind the essential safety of the FCC staff and those people on the ground doing the real work. So, that has to be considered as well.
Yeah, Ted, your last point was going to be my first point, and that is that the safety of the FCC staff was the reason, one of the primary reasons the FCC delayed the CBRS auction. I would add that the FCC gave folks about 9 or 10 months lead time on the RDOF auction, which is an unusually long kind of lead time. Usually it's, people kind of know, but they don't know, and it may be 6 months out or 5 months out. So I think folks have a good opportunity to prepare themselves for the auction. I do know the commission is very committed to doing this auction, or at least starting the auction before the election comes around. And so my personal view at this point in time on March 27th is that we should not, let's move forward with October 22. Obviously, if circumstances change or worsen, or we have other issues, then it might be reason for delay. I'd almost argue that having a recession would be reason to accelerate or not delay the auction, because that creates a greater need for federal subsidies to promote broadband deployment.
Thanks. John talked in his overview about the limited challenge process, where parties have an opportunity to contest the preliminary list of eligible areas and basically file comments by, I think it's April 5th, to remove areas from the list. This is a question again for Steve and Ted. Either of you can jump in. Do you have any advice to the WISP audience as to whether to participate in that process or not? And to repeat, this would be to remove areas from the list. So it could be a situation, for instance, where a WISP has recently deployed service, or a WISP has an interest in, has been getting started but hasn't yet reported anything in Form 477 because they, haven't yet completed the deployment. So what's your advice to the WISP in terms of should they participate or not?
So let me try to take that one first. I've talked to a few folks already, and in these cases, they've decided that it makes good sense for them to go ahead and participate in the challenge process because they have overbuilt customers that maybe were at 10.1 or something less than 25.3 before, and they've upgraded that service, or they've added voice to their networks, or they've expanded their service into new areas. And some of them are what I call playing defense, and that is, doing what they can to take those areas off the auction block. Others may say, I have a pretty good situation here, and I'm just going to sort of sit this out. And even though I'm only at 10.1, I think I've got a pretty good shot. So if I want to upgrade to 100 by 20, it'd be nice to have some federal subsidy for me to be able to do that, even though there may be a risk in them, a competitive risk in the auction that somebody else may come in. So those are sort of the two, what I call playing defense, playing offense approaches. And then there's folks that may want to do some of both. But I think it really comes down to making a business decision as to what you choose to do.
Ted,
Yeah, and I
anything
would
to
just
add?
add to that yeah, I think throughout the rulemaking process for USF, one thing that's notable is that the commission has sought to make these rules fair to all, and I think this limited challenge process creates that opportunity for fairness that people should look at and determine whether they want to be proactive or reactive. And so I agree with Steve's point there.
Thanks. One of the things that's ongoing now, which John highlighted, is the FCC is seeking public comment on the auction procedures. And the way I think about this is it's the mechanics of how the bidding and related activities, the actual bidding will occur. And among other things, the FCC is taking comment on issues such as the minimum geographic area for bids, whether to adopt any presumptions or prohibitions on eligibility to bid in certain service tiers, a proposal to limit bids to bidding on no more than the nationwide auction budget, and also, what information should be provided to bidders from round to round while the auction is ongoing. So again, for Steve and Ted, if you had to pick one procedure that's still out for comment as critical to performance in the auction, what would you pick?
Let me say first that I'm going to defer to Steve on this totally, because today is the deadline for getting comments back to the FCC.
I'm trying to steal your thunder, like reveal what you're going to say.
I know, and I'm not going to give it to you.
Okay.
Well,
Unless Steve does. Maybe Steve will.
I will, because I know this is going to be recorded after we file our comments, and besides, we've got John here on the phone, and I know he really wants an answer. So of these issues, I think there are instances of equipment that's being deployed today in the millimeter wave bands. It's available and has been for the last couple of years, and it's being deployed today that will allow fixed wireless technology to be used to bid at the gigabit tier. And I think when you look at WISPA's comments, you'll see that that discussion is prominent in what we're saying, and that what may have been true before the CAF auction is no longer true today, and that the FCC should kind of look at these on a case-by-case basis to determine whether the applicant is reasonably expected to be capable of meeting that performance characteristics, rather than establishing any kind of categorical restrictions on what technology can be that can be bid in a particular area. So that's a preview, John, of what you'll be reading.
I look forward
Thanks.
to it.
Thanks.
Shifting gears a bit, one of the things the FCC did in the RDOF auction adopted in January was it made clear that new entrants that are winning bidders in the RDOF that are authorized to receive funding will have to be prepared to offer voice service immediately. And just to take a step back, that's part of the core obligation that sometimes people overlook. The FCC expects, participants in this program to offer both voice service as well as broadband. But the obligation to offer voice immediately, has an impact on new entrants that may not yet have facilities in the area where they are the winning bidders. So what's your advice to companies that are thinking about the RDOF on how they actually will meet this obligation that the FCC has found?
I can start on that. I am seeing adoption of voice services here in the last literally short number of weeks more as a defensive play to RDOF than a universal service as it's intended. Because I have to is a very bad way to start serving what is an essential service. Now, I'm all for WISPs taking on voice services. I think it's needed still in the marketplace, and it is a requirement here. So I would ask that we, consider the purpose why we bring on voice now. Is it because of a government rule, or is it because it's a service that you want to provide? And I think if it's the latter, you'll make much better decisions in your choices.
Yeah, and I'm
So,
sure one of the other issues, of course, is it depends on sort of the overall legal framework that the FCC is operating under. And as folks know, the voice is the quote supported service, and that is a statutory term, and that is something that the FCC has enunciated as what must be provided. And so one of the questions, getting back to sort of from a practical standpoint, is the answer that anyone that's participating in RDOF, do they have to basically resell voice service from some other party, most likely the incumbent telco, until they get their network up and running?
I think in a lot of ways that's going to be the natural consequence of the rule. That this was something that there was a lot of focus on what the broadband build out commitments should be, and I think kind of understanding when voice needed to be deployed was something that wasn't really, looking over the record, was not really made clear until the RDOF order. So I think this is kind of an unintended, I shouldn't say unintended, underappreciated portion of the RDOF order that will require recipients to immediately deploy service. And I think it will force some, I don't quite know what immediately is. And I think the language is immediately to be capable of. So, we can talk about how those get interpreted over time, but I would think perhaps not the way it was done in CAF, that folks need to have a voice solution to be able to deploy as soon as they receive their funding.
Yeah, and that's why I'm bringing it up, because I think this is, as I said, this is an underappreciated thing amongst the WISP community, and the folks that are going to be listening to this virtual session need to appreciate that decision was made, because it's not often talked about.
Correct.
Do you guys think that the clearing rule adopted by the FCC for the auction 904 will have a significant impact on the outcome of the auction compared to how things worked in the phase 2 auction?
What do you think, Ted?
Well, yeah, thanks, Steve. I think that the gigabit tier will prevail more definitely than it was in the CAF, to the extent that that tier is more expensive to build in terms of infrastructure and takes more time. That informs us that there's fewer households, and those households will be served at a later period of time than what is urgently needed now, particularly under the present circumstances of the COVID-19 virus. So in my mind, the current RDOF budget of $20.4 billion that is intended to serve 6 million locations in rural America is a sufficient budget to deliver 50 or 100 megabit service anywhere across the land and fulfill the obligation to bridge the digital divide. So I I believe that we need to go as fast as we can, and we need to, go with the service tiers and the technologies that can solve this problem sooner rather than later, because our future leaders are dependent on a way to become educated today.
Let me take a run at this in a little bit of a different way, and that is that the clearing round proposal, the clearing round bid processing rule that the FCC adopted could have a very significant effect on the auction by saying once we hit that clearing round of 16 billion for phase one, that at that point the FCC begins assigning bids to the bidder with the lowest T plus L, and basically kicking out or ejecting other bidders that may not be bidding at, say, the gigabit tier, but over the course of the auction may be able to bid down the subsidy to a point where they would prevail because the business model doesn't make sense to that fiber provider. So having that rule in place, I think, implies the importance of two other rules. One we just talked about, which is to allow fixed wireless to propose gigabit tier speeds and have the FCC assess that on a case-by-case basis and allow those that can make the case to get at the gigabit. And the second one, Carol alluded to a little while ago, and that is increasing transparency so that you know what that lowest TNL is in a given market, so that before the clearing round comes around, you can maybe move your bid from a place where maybe you're bidding at 100 by 20 and there is a gigabit competitor bidding in the same market, that maybe you can move your bid to another place, and that way more areas will get funded, because the area where the gigabit tier bidder is placing its bids is going to get funded. So rather than finish an automatic second place to that bidder, maybe you can be first place in another market. So I think you need to kind of pull back and look at the impact of some other potential auction procedures that would negate some of the things that the clearing round bid processing proposal might involve.
Yeah, and that raises a good point, which is ultimately the FCC's objective is to get service everywhere. So if procedures are adopted that make it possible for people to switch to other areas, fill in those gaps, at the end of the day, that's going farther towards achieving the FCC's universal service objective.
Agreed. And I think it creates the balance between, areas that can support, gigabit networks and future proofing and potential for supporting 5G services, and in other places where a business model today does not justify that is, but can justify 100 by 20 is, let's create that opportunity.
Right. Well, we're getting close to the end, so I'm going to present one last question, and then we'll close out. So my question again is, who do you think is the biggest competitive threat to this that want to participate in the auction? Is it head-to-head competition in a particular geography from the incumbent telco that currently is receiving phase 2 support? Or is it head-to-head competition in a particular geography from, as we were just discussing, somebody that may be bidding in the gigabit tier, and, potentially the WISP, going into this is thinking they're going to bid in the 100 or 50.
Well, I can say that I anticipate the bidding activity for Auction 904 to include more telcos than what we saw in the CAF.
And I agree with that.
It will be hit and miss.
No doubt.
There'll be some telcos that step aside because they've determined that they have a larger business model and demand to serve commercial services or tier 1 or tier 2 markets, and so as a company they may choose to participate only at a small level or not at all. Now, I've always said this to WISPs: if you have existing infrastructure in your market, you can build your services at a lower cost than an incumbent telco. And you can do it much more efficiently because you're naturally an innovative organization that does things efficiently. from beginning to end. So there's a clear advantage in terms of taking enough sufficient capital to build a network that they believe is right for their market. And then the second one we've talked on briefly is these low orbiter Earth satellite systems. I've said for a number of years, actually since the development of the CAF rules, that to the extent that universal service money is paid to satellite service providers, of which, by the way, they have a clear service to our marketplace, and we're glad to have them. But to the extent that we apply a large segment of these funds that we're talking about now into satellite systems, we are giving up a critical activity that's required in the way of middle mile fiber and more tower infrastructure that is required to develop mobile or fixed 5G networks.
That's a very good point. Steve, do you have anything to add?
I would just say this goes back to doing your due diligence, because I think each market could be very different. If there's an active electric co-op in your market, you should plan that they will bid, and they will bid aggressively at the gigabit tier. If you have an incumbent telco that is in your market that's at 10-1, you should probably expect that they will want to get more money to overbuild their networks. If you're in a really rural area and you don't have any of that competition, maybe the competition will come from another WISP, or maybe it'll be one of the low Earth orbit satellites. So I think it's a very sort of regionalized and local market oriented answer to your question.
I'll just add one more thing, and that is, there's in this country a significant investment in infrastructure by some really great companies that are doing amazing work in many applications and for the use of advanced communications. And the low orbiters have many markets around the world that can bring broadband to the many millions of others that have no infrastructure invested in their geographic areas. And so that's where I would prefer to see that go to work. Now, they're private enterprises. They are in business to make a profit, and they're going to go where they believe that they can accomplish that more readily. But in the United States, I see the critical value add that no one else has that would be unique to them would be to deliver capacity to these many towers that are being used for 5G and will be built for the use of 5G. So I see that as a critical item, and I also see them as an overlay network in the event of a national emergency, that we have another place to go for our broadband connectivity.
Well, thank you. All right. Well, I think with that, it's time to wrap up slightly more than an hour of this session. We regret, all of us, that we were not able to do this live in Dallas, but we are happy to be safe at home, and I hope everyone who listens to this is also safe at home. Things are moving along, as you've learned, very swiftly at the FCC. The FCC staff are pros at telecommuting, and they are chugging along, working to get this auction off the ground. So it's really important for everyone to pay attention to this, and do not become complacent or think that this is going to be postponed. Even if it is slightly postponed, it won't be postponed for long. So now is the time to be doing all of that due diligence and that preparation that we've talked about, that you've heard about, all the things that you need to be doing to get ready for this big opportunity. And with that, I will say thank you to my fellow panelists, and we're done.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Cheryl.
you.
Excellent job.